Libertarian Party of Minnesota, bringing you peace, prosperity, and freedom from the land of 10,000 lakes.
Hello, and welcome to Minnesota Liberty, sponsored by the Libertarian Party of Minnesota. It's our podcast, and I think we're on our 5th episode today. I'm your host, Rebecca Whiting, with our other host.
Hi, I'm Jason Kliets, the co-host of the evening.
And we are going to talk with Carrie Loch this evening about ranked choice voting and kind of go over it and legislations going on in the state right now. But first, I want to take a minute to remind everybody that the convention is coming up this weekend. If you would like to be part of the Libertarian Party of Minnesota, just direct you to the LPMN.org website and join there. So without further ado, hi, how's it going?
Hi, good to be here.
Welcome, Carrie.
Yeah. So
Hello.
I guess I'm just going to start out with, what is your background?
So I am a lawyer by training and I practice law. I have my own virtual law firm as kind of my professional sphere. I grew up in Minnesota, born and raised. I'm back in my hometown now, which is fun, having my kids go to school here and be close to family. So that's good.
Yeah. So what kind of law do you practice?
I primarily do personal injury law, and I also do some family law for some select clients, as well as legal analysis and writing for other attorneys. So kind of contract work, if they get big memos and motions and they don't want to do all of that very specific legal research. I do that on kind of hourly basis or projects for other attorneys with overflow as well.
Okay, cool. So it's kind of nice to, like, I know when we talk, a lot of times what you say is, the legal side of, that kind of vocabulary, and it's very different. So a lot of times, like, I'm just going to ask Carrie, and she'll be able to understand it and explain it. So, but today we're talking about ranked choice voting, and there is legislation that's going through our state. And do you want to explain maybe a little bit of background about that bill?
Sure. So I haven't followed that bill in particular. I actually found out that it was going through the state when I was doing research to prepare for the voter choice hearing that was heard at this very same committee meeting. But essentially what the bill does is it establishes a task force to review all of the things that would need to change or be modified and kind of come up with guidelines for how to transition to ranked choice voting if it were to be implemented. So it would permit localities to use ranked choice voting if they wanted to. It doesn't require the use of ranked choice voting, but it would, come up with the various things that you need to address and how to do it and how to implement it and how to educate voters about the transition. Because as we'll get into, ranked choice voting, I think, is a very wonderful thing, but it is a new way to vote, a new way to process the votes. People need to understand how it's working. And so there's just a lot to consider there.
So what exactly is ranked choice voting?
So the simple way to describe it is imagining you are sending a friend to get you a pop from a vending machine. You say, if they have Coke, I want Coke. If they don't, I don't want Pepsi, I want Mountain Dew instead. And if they don't have either, just get me water, right? So those are kind of your priorities and you kind of rank them. And then when the other person goes to the vending machine, if they don't have your ideal pick, there's an instant move of your vote to the next candidate. So how that functions in an election is there are different types of ranked choice voting, but if you have a single winner election, currently we use first past the post, which means the person who has the most wins, even if they have less than half. So it's the first one, the one that gets the farthest, the one that gets the most. And then they take the whole thing and the spoiler and all of that. There's, as we know as libertarians, there's a lot of background. So how ranked choice voting works in this context is people would rank their first candidate, their second candidate, their third candidate, on their ballot. And then if their first candidate, first, if no candidate exceeds the threshold to win in the first round, then the candidate with the least amount of votes is eliminated, and the second choice for those voters is then looked at, and those votes get reallocated. And then in the second round, if nobody is past the threshold needed to win, you go and you keep eliminating the additional options until there is a candidate who is past the threshold.
So that could mean that we would potentially go to the polls and vote more than once.
So the goal, it's called instant runoff voting because you don't have a runoff later. So I think it was Georgia where they had the senators. It's first past the post, but they have an interesting caveat where you need to have more than 50%, I believe it was. And neither of the candidates got that because there was a third party candidate who pulled a significant amount of the votes away. And so those voters had to come back on a second election day in order to vote again between only those two candidates. And ranked choice voting, the instant runoff version, variety of it, there's several different versions, makes it so that won't happen, right? You rank them all in your order of preference. And then if there's not a clear winner in the first round, then there's an instant runoff and you don't have to go back to the polls, which actually has a really great effect for voter turnout because so many people wouldn't go to a second election or wouldn't go back and vote a second time. There's a really big drop off when you see that. So for a state like Minnesota that, prides itself on voter participation and things like that, the instant runoff model would, include more people in the process.
So I was at the hearing for the House of Representatives where they talked about, the ranked choice voting, and so there was a lot of people testifying for and against it. And it appeared to me, and I didn't count because I wasn't. There was another bill coming later that I was there for, but in that case, it appeared as though there were a lot more people against it than there were for it. And a lot of those people were concerned about, and for instance, the Secretary of State was one of those people that testified, and he didn't have a position. He was neutral. But I remember him talking about concerns that, having the cost and having the ability to pull it off in the state, and that even if they did pass the bill, that it would take a substantial amount of time to get everybody in the state kind of in a position where it could actually be functional.
Yeah. So that is one thing that Steve Simon mentioned during his testimony. He just as kind of a point of clarification, because I'm interested in ranked choice voting, so I was listening very carefully. He was very careful to not oppose or support the bill. He did clarify that he'd had many concerns about it and that the author, I believe, had submitted, an author's amendment to address those. So the author had worked with the Secretary of State's office and corrected a lot of those concerns that his office had so that those would no longer be in this particular bill. So that's interesting that you thought that there were a lot of people against it. I noticed there were many, many people there for it. So I was actually not.
There were a lot of people
there.
there.
Were a lot of, that is true. A lot of people there. I would say that though that the kind of the tenor of the objections to it, in my view, were kind of just this concept of we've never done it that way before, and we think it seems bad. So, there were there were concerns about, whether it's constitutional because you only have one person, one vote. Well, okay. Another name for the instant runoff voting is called a single transferable vote, because you're only casting a vote for one candidate. But if your ideal candidate loses, you wipe the whiteboard and then you reallocate. So you ultimately only end up having one vote. It's just if, a way to think of it is if you're, if there was a runoff, right? Like if in Georgia, right? If there was, you cast your ballot in the first one, and then that candidate didn't make enough, there wasn't enough threshold. And so they had to come back on a second day. And the people who voted for the third party candidate were able to vote again. So it just combines that process. And, Minnesota already has implemented this. It's being done in Minneapolis to elect their local officials. So that's, it's been reviewed by courts, and there's no problem with it from that perspective. Regarding the cost of it, there are maybe more paper might be needed, or things like that. But the specifics of the cost difference aren't known yet. That's something that the task force would look into. And for a state that prioritizes voter engagement, we still have a very large amount of the population that doesn't vote. And they feel like there's no point in voting because their candidate won't win, and they don't want to engage in the process. So I view ranked choice voting as the one change to the system that would have the largest ripple effects to advanced liberty, because people can vote for third parties knowing that their vote won't be wasted, or people can actually vote their conscience without feeling like they're wasted. And I think it would just bring more people into the process.
Yeah. So that day for the House of Representatives, it was interesting because that bill was talking about, getting more people on the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And then the very next bill that we sat in on was talking about making the threshold higher for major party status, which would restrict political parties.
Yeah.
And the very same committee that was hearing the ranked choice voting was also hearing the ballot access bill.
Right. It was very interesting to hear how, and it wasn't even the same committee. It was, I think you said that literally the very next bill that the same committee
we didn't even leave
reviewed.
the
It finished, approving ranked choice voting, extolling the virtues of third parties and the importance to have, options and all of that, and to empower voters and to include people, get people on the ballot. And the very next bill they considered was the opposite, to prevent options on the ballot, to make it harder for people to get on.
Yep.
And that bill actually that they're still kind of trying to push through is kind of tied to some of the concerns that, as far as I can make out, that libertarians in particular object to using ranked choice voting, for the ones who do object to it. And it has to do with qualification for major party. And the concern is that, if you vote for libertarians in the first round, but eventually your votes are reallocated, ultimately, if your ballot is either exhausted because you didn't vote for any more candidates and none of yours were among the winners, or your vote gets reallocated to someone else. And so the concern is, if we have to reach a certain percentage of the vote of a threshold, but the votes are being reallocated, so we're always going to get 0%, then there's no way to meet the threshold.
Right.
A very simple solution for that is to use the first round percentages when determining thresholds.
And the result for each, the votes were very much so down party lines.
Yes.
So in each case, the 8 Democrats voted for the, passing through the House, and the 4 Republicans voted against it in both cases.
Yeah.
So obviously it's not a partisan, it's a partisan issue. So it's, there's nonpartisan support.
Right. And it was interesting to note that, regarding the increasing the barriers for minor parties to major party status and ballot access and all that, the Republicans on the committee did note that there was not unified Republican support for it, as the GOP's statement, seemed to indicate. So that was very telling. One of the other little twists that libertarians, would be familiar with is the concept of NOTA, so none of the above. And that can provide a wrinkle in a ranked choice voting if the system isn't set up properly. So again, this is one of the reasons for the task force, to figure out what are all of the wrinkles, how would you need to educate voters, and to have those resources so each locality isn't reinventing the wheel and running into all the same problems, right? To have kind of a template and recommendations and issues to consider. NOTA would be one of those if it were an option in government elections and not, internal things. But
might get more people out to vote.
That might be an interesting way to do it, introduce an option to vote for NOTA, and if NOTA wins, like, none of you guys are able to run again. You all just are horrible. You lose. No, you can't run again. That would be great. I think
we should have offered that as an amendment.
That would be wonderful. I would love that.
I'm in.
Oh yeah, that would be so good. But the way that it functions in ranked choice voting, it just depends on the specific rules that are implemented to govern ranked choice voting, similar to the concern about whether or not somebody would meet the threshold. So if the ranked choice voting rules say that none of the above can never be eliminated, or the ballot can never be spoiled or exhausted, then a small minority of votes can prevent the other candidates from reaching the thresholds that they need to. And that is particularly exacerbated when you have a heightened threshold. So instead of a 50% threshold or simple majority, you have 2/3 or super majority or some heightened threshold. It makes it so that a very small number of votes can prevent their being elected, a successful winner or candidate or whatever it is, anyone from winning. And the 2/3 or a heightened issue is related, but it's not particularly unique to NOTA. So even if nobody votes for none of the above, everybody casts their ballots, but you have a heightened threshold of 2/3, theoretically the split could go 49-51 and you don't have a winner. So that particular combination can be bad, but again, those are structural issues for how things get set up. And so if you treat none of the above as any other candidate, they get stricken, then you reallocate the votes, all of that. Then it solves part of that problem. And then again, if you don't have a heightened supermajority threshold, then it really alleviates a lot of those concerns.
Okay. So what happens if in ranked choice voting somebody just writes down, or a fair number of people just write down one name as opposed to multiple names? How would that affect the vote?
So if that candidate did not exceed the threshold to be elected in the first round, and they were actually the lowest candidate, the candidate that received the fewest votes, then that ballot, that voter gets crossed off, and there's no more options for that voter. So, that happened, that some people were really concerned about that you're disenfranchising people, or, that was kind of a concern at the committee hearing, but it's only disenfranchising people to the same extent that voting for anybody other than the legacy parties would be disenfranchising people, because you're not, your person's not going to win. The person you voted for didn't win. And so, to that same extent, it's disenfranchising people. And I actually take issue with those who call it disenfranchisement, because in reality, people are choosing not to vote for someone else. Now, again, that's assuming there's been good voter education campaigns. People understand it's ranked choice, right? You make that transition. But if you're doing that education and explaining how it works, and somebody intentionally only votes for one person, in my view, that's the same thing as doing one person NOTA, right? It's saying, I don't want to support anybody else to win. And that sends a really important signal to elected officials. If there's 50% of the votes in the first round are a scattershot of third parties, and then a ton of them drop off because none of them voted in the second round, that is really, really useful information. The Libertarian Party and third parties, all of that, the legalized the cannabis parties, they're providing very important ideas, and all of these things that were extolled during the ranked choice voting the praises that they had for the third parties, that there's so many good ideas that appear in third parties before the legacy parties adopt them, which makes sense. A smaller group of people get together and they agree on it and they keep beating that drum, and then eventually it makes its way into the mainstream consciousness. That just makes sense. But it's really, it would be very valuable to getting helpful feedback. If people, believe in democracy and want to have, represent the voters and what they believe, and I'm here to work for you, right? Well, if you had that signal to get more information back, you would really be able to read a lot of it. If there's a large chunk of people who voted for the legalized cannabis now candidate in the first round, but it wasn't over the threshold, then it prioritizes the urgency and ranking of interests of voters. If you have all of the different unique parties, right? If you have a let's just hypothetical party that was 100% all about guns, and we want everybody to have guns and we're going to repeal everything, right? if more voters voted to legalize marijuana, the Marijuana Now party, and then less numbers did, right? But you can see what are voters' top issues in that first round, even if those candidates don't end up winning. And it actually, it makes people feel like they have a voice, right? People are actually voting for candidates they like instead of against candidates that they dislike. And so it just is a really helpful tool to make people feel like they have a voice. And it ultimately requires candidates in the long term to become more civil, because if they're not the first choice for voters, they at least want to do some coalition building with maybe the minor parties so that they're the second choice. You're probably not going to swing someone from a 50% legacy party to the other 50% legacy. That's probably not going to happen. But it really encourages coalition building and civility with the other parties. There generally is tension once the third parties kind of start to creep up in the percentages that they're gathering. There's generally tension there, but I think it's a really good way to get third parties involved and to really have people's voices be heard for what are their priorities.
So could there theoretically be 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans all on the same ballot for ranked choice voting? It would have to be set up in a way that specifically says that's okay. Okay. So, currently, for a single winner race in Minnesota, there's a candidate that the party can put forward. If there were, you can do ranked choice voting in multiple winners, like for single city council or things like that. And you could have, 5 Democrats running for 2 seats, but you already can have that. You already can have multiple people from the same party running in a multi-winner election. But the current setup for single winner elections doesn't allow that, because you have to be the endorsed candidate for this spot from your party, from whatever it is. So that was a concern that some people noted, which again, I was like, that's not, it doesn't have to be like that. So if the bill fully passes and it goes through all the steps and it becomes law, are there any other states currently using ranked choice voting for statewide elections?
There have been other states. I believe Alaska's doing it. The Ranked Choice Voting Resources organization has a really, really good, it's just a resource center. Sorry. They have a lot of really good resources. They're a resource center. And they work with really anybody who's dealing with ranked choice issues. They work with policymakers, they make with lawmakers to help them do that. And they have a list of jurisdictions that use RCV and links to their particular governing, statutes and all of their information. And they kind of explain how it works. And they actually have a video on there that was done by NPR, Minnesota Public Radio, when Minneapolis was, related to ranked choice voting and how it works and all that. And I believe it was sent out as part of the education campaign when Minneapolis was switching over to use ranked choice voting in their local issues, their local elections.
Okay. And then, so if or when this passes, how long do they have? Would it take effect the next statewide election?
So the localities would need to opt into it. What is happening now? I believe it's like a 2-year or a 3-year process, something like that, maybe 2 years, I think, for them to come up with these recommendations, to work with the Secretary of State. The people who were on the committee, they're required to include the actual people, a certain number of actual people in the counties who administer the elections, to get that really good feedback of concerns and questions and how would it work and what would, all these issues, so that when the recommendations are being put together, all of those things are addressed, right? So that you can have this really robust body of, Minnesota specific things that you should consider if you are going to do this for your locality. And what it would allow is for, as I've said several times, for local jurisdictions, for cities, for counties, for places that are doing the elections to opt in. It wouldn't require anybody to do it this way, but it would say you can if you want to, and you can do it for more than only the elections inside your jurisdiction. So that's why Minneapolis does it for like city council and things like that, where it's only Minneapolis related, is because they currently cannot elect a statewide office with that method. So it would permit them, and I believe it is on the timeline where it would not be this body of literature and recommendations and all of that would not be allowed to, localities wouldn't be able to implement RCV until, I believe, after 2026. So they would not be able to do it for statewide elections during the 2026 election. So it would be a couple years out. And then there would need to be legislation as well, based on the recommendations, specifically modifications needed in statutes, all of that, as well as the actual kind of body of information for the municipalities and for the local jurisdictions. There would need to be proposal as well for changes to the law. And that would need to work its way through. So we would have the whole conversation again about whether or not we want to do this, actually do it, given whatever the results of that particular task force would be. Yeah.
So you talked about the race in Georgia,
Yes.
And that candidate was Chase Oliver, right?
Yeah.
So he's actually going to be at our convention this coming weekend.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Well, I just found out too. So
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, while we were sitting here talking, got a message. I'm like, oh, I didn't know. Cool.
That's really
no
cool.
pressure.
The Georgia one really was interesting because the talk of third parties as spoilers or messing anything up with that, it's a very, very helpful data point for the major parties or the legacy parties in Georgia that, look, you have to campaign again. And you're right. Like, you have to actually get over this threshold. You can't just get the most out of everyone. And that means you have to try to appeal to these voters that didn't vote for you, right? Like, it really changes the strategy and moving forward, not being so dismissive of the Libertarian candidates so that they could maybe try and get some votes, so trying to incorporate those ideas, really back to what we were saying about new ideas and important things coming up through third parties. Just what happened in Georgia, a lot of people were upset by it and we're saying the Libertarian candidate spoiled the election and now everybody has to do it all over again. We have to do it all over again and this is ridiculous. And it's like, that is literally the point, is that these two candidates were not appealing to the majority of people. And the majority of people said no. And the legacy parties have to listen to that. So I understand people's frustration on it, which something like instant runoff voting, ranked choice voting would solve that problem. But, an alternative is having a minimum threshold where, you have to, in addition to getting the most votes, you have to get up over a 50% threshold. But yeah, kind of as I mentioned, that concept of like vote stealing or people that were mad with Chase about how he took votes away from whatever candidate, ranked choice voting solves that. It reallocates and you don't have to come back for a separate runoff because it's instant.
Yeah, I was just Googling really fast, trying to figure out what percentage he got, because honestly.
Yeah, it wasn't a huge percentage, but it
I think it
was
was just over 2% he got.
Yeah, it was
2%?
it was a very well, I think it was more like 5.
I'm gonna look it
I don't
up.
know, but it was really it was a very close race. So the fact that he pulled, if I'm remembering correctly, he pulled a larger amount of votes than people were kind of expecting, and the other two candidates were really close, and so they neither one of them got up over that 50% threshold. Let me see. Okay, so actually I found here where, back to your question about where ranked choice voting is used. It's in Alaska, Maine, New York City, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and San Francisco.
Okay. So I know I talked to, going into the committee, I talked to a couple of our, third party. It wasn't all libertarians, but it was, I talked to several other people that were also part of other third parties about what their opinion was about ranked choice voting and the bill in, currently going through the process in the state. Mostly their concerns were that the Democrats were going to end up using it as a way to basically stack the vote, and we're going to use it as to their own advantage, intentionally trying to push other parties out. So what I know from talking to you that overall you generally support ranked choice voting, but what would be some arguments against trying to, like a bill like this, or maybe some of the people's concerns about the ways that it could be abused? Because honestly, right now in our country, there's a very low, people are just generally untrustworthy of the voting process.
Yeah.
And
so I mean, a part of I've tried very hard to engage people who do not support ranked choice voting in explaining their reasons and providing me with resources to learn more about their objections. And as far as I can tell, the concern about stacking the vote or running a slate of a bunch of other candidates so that they would be reallocated to the Democrats, as we discussed, those candidates would have to be not actually endorsed or the nominated candidate for a single victor election, because the current laws in Minnesota specifically require that the candidate be nominated for the position, and if there's a single victor, then there's one. So the other ones it would have to be a behind the scenes thing where the voters couldn't be like, I'm going to vote for all the Democrats. And also, there's not really a point to doing that at all in the single victor position, because all those people could just vote for the Democrat candidate in the first round. There's just no point in doing it. As some of the other concerns are about how a third party would reach voter thresholds, which we talked about. And again, it's just all of the concerns that I have run up against are kind of objections to, well, if it played out this way, then that would be really horrible, which I would agree with. But you have barriers to that, either in the statute, now, or the task force would identify that this needs to be changed, or they would come up and they would find these issues. So I mean, there are different types of ranked choice generally, and then the devil's in the details. So very specifically how the statutes work, how are they operating? It's a conceptual framework, kind of like, first past the post, right? The person who gets the most wins. Well, except in this state, you also have to be above 50%, right? So it's like you can add in safeguards and other things based on concerns that people have. One of the concerns, I know an opponent at the hearing mentioned that there was a lot of frustration in Alaska, I think it was Alaska, about how it played out, and that really big concern. And I mean, again, that's a voter education issue, because a lot of voters didn't know that they were supposed to rank multiple people. And so then in that first election, people, get really frustrated because they don't understand, they show up to vote, or they get their ballot, they fill it out wrong, or they only vote once, or whatever it is. And again, that's a voter education issue. And in Minneapolis, and, there could be in a statewide move as well, to really highlight how to fill out the ballot. And, Steve Simon's office, Secretary of State's office, they have a lot of energy behind get out the vote, voter education, voter registration. They send out a lot of materials. They're very, very active in that. And so to me, that it seems like a very natural progression that as part of that campaign, you're easily notifying people, hey, we're doing ranked choice voting and it'll be a little bit different, but you get to, put people in the order that you would prefer them. And, this is how it looks like. This is a sample ballot, all of these things. So it really seems like there could be, or that there is a lot of space for overlap and utilizing some of the habits and systems that we already have, particularly in Minnesota, in order to make that transition easier.
Oops.
All right.
Yeah.
So is there a big difference between what Alaska is doing and what Maine is doing for their ranked choice voting? I do have an understanding that they differ in some ways.
Yeah, I'm not too sure on the specifics of all of the ones that are implemented in those areas. I do know that there have been more states where I believe the DNC, has used ranked choice voting in primaries. So those voters would, but they're not used in the general election. So those voters would additionally be kind of familiar with ranked choice if they voted in the primary. But there are there are many different versions of ranked choice voting. And, there's proportional ranked choice voting, which the experience itself is pretty similar to, actually, I think it's exactly the same to voting in a single victor race. But that's obviously something that would be used for multiple seats. And you get kind of the proportional award based on the number that you would receive. So that's a very poor explanation of it. But that's the type of thing where the spoiling effect or the concerns about Democrats, running a slate and swamping out everyone else or something like that. If there's multiple victors and it is a partisan election, they already can do that. So again,
I found the information about Chase Oliver. He got 2.07% of the vote.
Wow.
But that made it so that the Democrat candidate for Senate only got 49.4%, and the Republican 48.4%. So it was already a very, very close race. Right. So I feel like 2% of the vote is not that is not a significant number, especially not in a state like Georgia, Atlanta and all the population. But 2% was enough to make them have to think through some things.
Right. And that really, some people are very upset that 2% of the people, this is ridiculous, we have to come back. And it's like, okay, but next election, when the polls are saying it's really, really tight, you think those candidates are going to pay attention to the 2%? Right. Yeah, probably they will. They probably will. Or, they'll make nods or, try to be less demonizing or dismissive of people who hold that belief, which ultimately, repeat that. It leads to, over time, better outcomes, more civil communications, at least between the parties and candidates who, may not appear to be winning in the first round. And one of the other critiques that I guess would counter to what I just said. Some people say, oh, places that have implemented it have not seen an increase in civility, or they have not seen those things happen. Well, they also haven't had it implemented for very long. So, the situation in Georgia, it's kind of that adage of, you don't want to make new law when there's a crisis, because you're not going to be thinking straight. You're not going to make good policy. You don't just want to say, here's a crisis, we need to change it now. It's like, okay, you need to go back through and remember why it was set up. What's the purposes? Is this a big picture good thing for the system and how it's going to function? And so, to the people in Georgia who would be randomly listening to a Minnesota Libertarian podcast, I don't know, but to the people, they might, I don't know, you never know. But to the people, in Georgia, I understand that really, really big frustration. A lot of them probably didn't realize it needed to be over 50%. Especially not if they, regularly vote for one of the legacy parties. But now they are, right? Now they are. And now that system is functioning the way it was designed to.
So in that case, the Democrat only got less than 38,000 more votes than the Republican.
It was
so
very, very close.
Yeah, that 2%, I mean, that can be substantial. So if anybody's like, well, my vote doesn't count anyways. In this case, it did, so he got 81,000 votes, but the Republican was only 38,000 behind the Democrat. So
yeah, I mean, and it really is, that adage of the, spoiling elections will continue until liberty improves. That, nobody wants to vote for you. You do not support liberty. So if you want to not have your election be spoiled, maybe try freedom.
Right. Well, and then the case of this, the response, instead of being like, well, maybe the third parties and the minority voters, or the people who are, voting in the minority are, they're trying to tell us something. Maybe we should listen. Maybe we should try to be more competitive. Instead, their reaction is, well, we just need to limit third parties.
Right. And that's the exact opposite. I mean, that's the exact opposite reaction to the information you're getting. You're missing the entire point of what the voters are telling you, right? They're telling you, we don't see a noticeable difference between these two candidates, even though they are, at each other's throats and I'm assuming that, I didn't follow the Georgia election all that closely before it happened. But
Georgians are an excitable bunch. So
okay.
I'm from the South. I can say that.
You can say that. Yeah. The election was very, very close, which means despite how far apart they are, the people were not seeing a clear winner, not wanting a clear winner, and that very, very small amount of voters voted for somebody who was very different than those two. So it is very useful information. And, when we turn off that kind of information, that kind of feedback, when you ignore, signals that something's happening, when you, we saw that a lot from the government in the last couple of years, just ignoring all of the indicator signals that some things were not the way they were supposed to be. But it's just the opposite reaction that you should have. Assuming any of the politicians actually care about what the people think, which the data actually suggests they don't.
Yeah.
So with ranked choice voting, would it help secure elections in some sense? I know election security has been a hot button topic since 2020.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So in order to tabulate ranked choice votes, when you have a large number, particularly when you have a large number of votes, right? I mean, it is an instant runoff. So if you don't have a clear winner in the first round, it takes more time to count them. There's the RCV Resource Center has resources, as one would expect, and that includes the software needed and recommended, the machines and things like that do tabulate them differently. But that would be a shift as well. That would definitely need to be a lot of discussion with the population about, because if there is not a winner in round 1 or round 2, round 3, right? Like the longer it takes to come up with a winner, the more concerned people get that there's corruption and cheating and things like that. So that, I mean, that would definitely have to be something that would need to be, kind of talked through with voters. I would be a supporter of saying, this is where we are after the first round. This was the result. We don't have a winner. We are going to reallocate. And now we're doing the second round counting, right? So just like that people know in real time why it's taking so long, what's going on, when things are reallocated, how many were actually reallocated, how many ballots were spoiled, how many, didn't have a second candidate. And so when their candidate got crossed off, that ballot is exhausted. Technically different things than spoiling, but the ballot is exhausted. How many was that? And people can cross-reference the numbers and make sure you don't have a random, 20,000, 30,000 jump in the number of ballot totals. So that RCV doesn't necessarily make it better. It could cause more concern if there wasn't transparency with it, right? I mean, that's a lot of the concern with voting machines now, or that, the various softwares are proprietary and the companies have all these secrets, and that's a lot of the concern. So if RCV were implemented in a way that was transparent as to the counting of the different rounds, that I think that would really go a long way. And also, I mean, you can't simply say, oh, this would be a negative to it, therefore we shouldn't, like, this is the negative and there is a negative, therefore we shouldn't make the change. You also have to look at the benefit. And just my view of talking with people, looking at the statistics, look at, the huge number of people who want a third party, right? Who want a different option, and will also say, but I won't vote for it because it's not going to win. Right? There's so much desire for people to feel hope. I mean, people want to feel like they have a voice in the system, and they don't. And so that just can really, really lead to this skepticism and this spiral down into, thinking the system's rigged, people are selected, right? All of that. And so if you empower voters to say, no, your voice will be heard in RCV, and you can vote for who you actually want, that, I mean, and I don't have data on this. It's just kind of like talking with people and what would they think and all that. To me, that seems like that would be a much, much larger positive boost to voters, and their belief in the system and feeling like they actually have a voice, right? The benefit to voter confidence would be so great that, as long as you're also implementing safeguards like transparency at the different rounds and as much, open source that you can do and all of that, as long as you're doing both of those, I feel like the net benefit would be so significant, not only to voter confidence, but also to, down the line, actually having more than two parties, elected. And then you start to get all these ripples because you have actual conversations where there's different ideas being presented, and, underlying premises are being challenged, and all these different things that really start to ripple out. And, this is kind of mixing the two concepts together, but at the hearing about increasing the barriers to major party status and ballot access, Rebecca, you pointed out that the country, the current country that we revolted against to break free from the king, has like 17 different parties represented in its parliament. It's way more representative of their population than we are.
House of Lords had 10 actively serving, and House of Commons had 12 actively serving.
Oh, I thought it was 17.
Well, I mean, combined, I don't know. Some of them are kind of obscure because they had like a Welsh nationalist party, and because they're different.
Right. But I mean, that contrast for me, particularly when you said that, it was like, oh man, that is painful. Like, that is painful. Even if we, believe that the Democrats and Republicans are genuinely on different sides and believe and support and advocate for different things, that's still painful to only have two choices. It's so painful.
Well, it puts people on a line,
Right,
and
right.
politics can't be on just a two-dimensional
Right,
line.
right.
It's not just, that's not the way reality works.
Right. Like I said, you can't just look at one factor and say, this is the one thing that determines the outcome. No, you have to look at unintended side effects, unintended consequences, all of that. And that's actually one reason that when I realized that the committee was voting on a task force to review this thing, on one hand, it's like, task forces, good job, government, like being all slow. But on the other hand, it was like, that is a very methodical way to do that. That is not just saying, we think this is great, let's do it, let's be careless, let's make this huge change without, talking with the people who will implement this. So for me, it was actually very, very encouraging to see that they were being very methodical about it and doing it through a task force that would consider those issues and make sure that there would try to minimize any unintended consequences and try to consider as many things as possible. So that was
we have a few minutes left, but I wanted to hit on something. I want to ask your opinion on it because I know I have my opinion, but the voting trend and the way that the country is going and the way I feel like in Minnesota with the last election, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the Republican candidate lost by a landslide. Like it wasn't even close.
Yeah.
And they couldn't blame the Libertarians in that race because we weren't even on the ballot. So, there wasn't, that was not our fault. But it has created a situation in our state where they can't say if I vote for you guys, I'm just pulling votes away from the Republicans because the Republicans are losing all on their own.
Yeah.
They're not without any help from anybody else. So I feel like that is going to help initiate a trend where people are going to, presented with that situation, consider that maybe they're just not a viable option. And, that maybe consider a third party that could in the future overcome the Democrats.
Yeah. I mean, in a kind of, related to that, this concept of, wasting your vote on a third party and all of that. If you live in a district that's heavily one direction and you don't want that candidate, your vote is wasted, right? Like I several months ago, sold my house, moved. I was living in Ilhan Omar's district. Okay. She does not represent me. And there's no way anyone other than the Democrat. I mean, there was a very, very good fight. Her challenger was, I can't remember her name. She was an African-American, woman. And she was just really inspiring and it was just really, really cool. So like there was a fight, but even that, it was a landslide, right? So everybody who voted for a Republican in that district, guess what? Your vote was wasted. There's no chance, right? Or it's like voting, for a Democrat in a really, really, really red area where they get 15% or 30% of the vote. Like that vote is wasted. You actually could do a lot more by voting for a third party so that the next election, you have more options because then they can get on the ballot. They can, they get a larger percent of the vote. So, when you're looking at who to vote for, of course, I'm like, vote for the Libertarian. They're probably going to be way better, but not always, but, generally. But I really also, for people who are on the edge and are using the I don't want to waste my vote, I really try to get them to think about what are the breakdowns in your district. You're voting not in an abstract, right? We don't have a national popular vote. We don't have a popular vote, right? It's based on these geographical areas. And so look at your actual area and see if your vote doesn't matter anyway. And if not, then vote for somebody you actually want. If I can't convince you to just vote for someone you want, that's the way I'm going to talk to you about it.
Yeah. But we have seen through American history, like, the political swing. Yeah, in particular, I think that it's the most evident in the South, through the everything like with Martin Luther King and all that kind of stuff. And that we saw, through the generations. And I'm from the South, and I know it's it's kind of starting to change and go back to blue in the major cities now.
Right.
But growing up, it was deeply red.
Yeah.
And, but, looking at the history too, I don't think it's so much though, as though people are changing their minds, is that the younger generations are growing up with a different mindset.
Yeah.
And that, eventually the older generations are going to die out. It's just the natural progression of, being a human, and that those younger generations are going to become older, and then are also going to have this, cultural opinion, and that's going to sway the vote one way or the other. So,
yeah, I mean, there is, the most recent gubernatorial election in Minnesota was kind of a blowout. But I'm not so sure that particular outcome would have happened with a different Republican candidate. Not saying the Republican candidate was exceptionally bad, but there were some statements and things that he forwarded that didn't have proper documentation and just gave enough gaffes or enough things that could be used as, a soundbite that just seemed insane, and yeah. So, I mean, I think that particular one, if you have somebody else doing it, it wouldn't necessarily have had the same outcome. And so I don't necessarily think it's a trend. And especially if with what the, Democrat controlled everything is happening in the Minnesota government right now, I think that they are going to go so far out over their skis that the Minnesotans are going to kind of go a little bit not crazy, but really have a backlash to it, being a sanctuary state for, trans surgeries on minors, being a sanctuary state for abortion at any point, having a huge surplus and spending it all and still raising taxes even more.
And the gun control bills.
I mean, like, all of these things are not Minnesota nice. They are not like discussing this rational. So I think that once particularly the LPMN now, really starts translating these concepts into the language of normal people, that we really can wake a lot of people up. And I know people like to joke about, mini Fornia or whatever, Cali soda. But I'm not completely lost on this state. I love this state. I grew up here. And I think we're doing great work. So.
Well, that looks like a good point to wrap up this episode. Thank you for coming on, Carrie.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great chatting with you guys.
So I just want to point people again to the lpmn.org website if you want to join the Libertarian Party. It only costs really $5-10 a month to become a party, and then you get a vote in the future of the Libertarian Party of Minnesota. So thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And also remember, convention is this weekend. We are going to have potential Libertarian presidential candidates showing up to pitch their run for presidency. That's why Chase Oliver will be here, and there's a few others.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.